There is no worse way to die than being displayed like a trophy on the walls of your own city. On that sweltering day in July 1537, Robert Aske was hoisted up York's castle walls in chains, left to starve while his neighbors watched in horror. He wasn't given a trial by his peers, nor was he granted the mercy of a quick death. He was simply erased, day by painful day, until he was nothing but bones and regret swinging in the summer air. It is a sick, cosmic joke because Aske never actually wanted to be a soldier. He was just a lawyer who accidentally became the most powerful man in England. For a brief shining moment, he commanded a pilgrimage of over 30,000 followers, a force that dwarfed the king's own army and could have easily taken London without breaking a sweat. Yet he remains perhaps the strangest rebel in the history of the world. He held the fate of the kingdom in the palm of his hand, but surrendered his own neck to the hangman, all because he naively, tragically believed that the law still mattered to a mad king. England in the 1530s was a terrifying world, facing a period of extreme instability that threatened the daily survival of people in the north. In these rugged, remote areas, monasteries were not merely religious buildings for silent prayer. They were the economic and social engines of the entire region. They acted as hospitals for the sick, schools for the young, and the only reliable source of food for the poor in times of famine. Spiritually, the connection was even deeper. The monks prayed for the souls of the dead to shorten their time in purgatory. The locals believed with absolute certainty that closing these institutions meant abandoning their ancestors to eternal suffering in the afterlife. It was a breach of a spiritual contract that had existed for centuries. The crisis escalated when Henry VIII broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn. His chief enforcer, Thomas Cromwell, saw the church not as a spiritual vessel but as a piggy bank. Cromwell, a man of cold efficiency and modern ruthlessness, viewed the monasteries as sources of quick liquid capital. He planned to seize their gold, melt down their lead roofs, and sell their vast estates to fund the government's wars and the king's lavish lifestyle. In 1536, Cromwell unleashed his agents. He sent aggressive, arrogant officials from London to the north to inspect and shut down the abbeys. These men were not diplomats, they were thugs with royal warrants. They bullied the monks, smashed beloved religious statues, groped women, and showed total disrespect for local traditions. They rode into towns acting like conquerors in a foreign land. For the people of the north, this was a practical and emotional disaster. They watched in disbelief as strangers stripped the lead from the roofs of their churches, exposing the graves of their families to the rain and snow. They saw the only welfare system they had ever known being dismantled for profit. It felt like a direct assault on their community identity. The destruction left the population terrified for their future and the souls of their dead relatives. Despite this devastation, the medieval mind struggled to comprehend that the king himself could be at fault. The people did not blame King Henry VIII directly. They clung to the ancient belief that the king was God's anointed, a good man, who was simply being tricked and poisoned by evil counselors like Thomas Cromwell. This belief directed their anger specifically at the government machinery rather than the crown itself. The region became a powder keg, ready to explode to defend their way of life. They just needed a spark and a commander. They found him in a one-eyed lawyer named Robert Aske. Robert Aske was born around 1500 in Yorkshire, the third son of Sir Robert Aske of Autun. He was of the gentry, the crucial class of landowners, who stood as the bridge between the high nobility and the common peasantry. His lineage was ancient, respected, and deeply woven into the fabric of the North. He was connected by blood and marriage to the great power players, the Cliffords, the Earls of Cumberland, and the Percys, the Earls of Northumberland. In a twist of fate that would become deeply ironic, he was even a distant cousin to Jane Seymour, the woman who had recently replaced Anne Boleyn as Henry VIII's queen. Physically, Aske commanded attention, though perhaps not in the way a traditional hero might. He was tall and imposing, with a dark, intelligent face that betrayed a mind always at work. But his most striking feature was a permanent mark of violence. He was blind in one eye. The chroniclers of the time called him monocular. This single eye gave him an intense, penetrating gaze, as if he saw the world and the truth more clearly than men with two eyes. He was not a soldier by trade. He was a man of the mind. He was a barrister, a lawyer trained at Gray's Inn in London. In the chaotic, often brutal world of Tudor politics, Aske was a believer in the civilized rule of law. He believed in precedent, in negotiation, in the structure of society. He was known for a razor-sharp intellect, a deep, brooding piety, and a natural, almost hypnotic charisma that allowed him to speak to both the highest lord and the lowest peasant with equal ease. He had served as a secretary to the Earl of Northumberland, giving him a front-row seat to the machinations of power. Aske was a man who believed in the system. He believed that if you followed the rules, if you presented your case with logic and justice, the right outcome would prevail. This belief in the ultimate justice of the English Constitution was his greatest strength as a lawyer, but it would prove to be his fatal weakness as a rebel. In October 1536, the world turned upside down. Robert Aske was not planning a revolution. He was simply trying to get to work. The legal term was beginning in London, and Aske set out from Yorkshire on horseback, intending to ride south to the capital to resume his practice. He was a man concerning himself with writs, statutes, and property disputes, not armies and banners. But as he crossed the Humber River and rode into Lincolnshire, he rode straight into the mouth of hell. Lincolnshire had already exploded. A localized, chaotic rebellion had broken out in response to the arrival of the Bishop of Lincoln's registrar. Rumors were flying wild, propaganda that fed on fear. People whispered that the king was going to tax every baptism, every wedding, and every funeral, that the local parish churches were to be pulled down, that the people were to be reduced to serfdom. The common people of Lincolnshire, terrified and furious, had risen up. They were hunting down the king's commissioners with pitchforks and axes. Aske was recognized as he traveled. The rebels stopped him. They saw a gentleman, a lawyer, a man of status. In those days, a mob needed a gentleman to give it legitimacy. They demanded he take their oath. This was the hinge moment of his life. A different man might have spurred his horse and fled into the woods. A more ambitious man might have seen a chance for personal glory and seized control immediately to usurp the throne. A coward might have lied and slipped away in the night. Robert Aske did none of these things. Seeing the chaos around him, seeing the genuine fear in the eyes of the common people, something in Aske's character snapped into place. The combination of his rigid legal mind and his deep religious faith produced a moment of clarity. He did not run, he took the oath, but he didn't just join the mob, he began to organize it. However, the Lincolnshire Rising was doomed from the start. It was led by gentry who were terrified of their own actions, and when the king threatened them with destruction, they collapsed. The uprising fizzled out. Aske, seeing the failure in Lincolnshire, turned his horse around. He did not go to London. He rode back to Yorkshire. He carried the spark of rebellion back across the Humber, but he had learned a vital lesson from the failure in Lincolnshire. He realized that a mob could be easily dispersed, but a movement could not. If the North was to rise, it had to be disciplined. It had to be moral. It had to be legal, or at least it had to appear legal. When Aske arrived back in Yorkshire, the beacons were already burning on the hilltops. The bells were ringing backward, the traditional alarm signal of the North. The commons were rising. But this time, Aske placed himself at the head of the storm. Aske's genius and his ultimate tragedy lay in his branding. He realized that if they called themselves rebels, they were morally bankrupt before they even started. Rebellion against God's anointed king was a mortal sin. It was treason against the state and heresy against heaven. No pious man could support it. So, Aske reframed the entire narrative. He declared that this was not a rebellion. It was a pilgrimage. He coined the name that would echo through history, the pilgrimage of grace. He told his followers that they were not marching to overthrow Henry VIII. They were marching to save him. They were marching to rescue the king and the Commonwealth from the low-born, parasitic, and heretical counselors who had poisoned the king's mind. They were fighting for the Holy Church, for the restoration of the monasteries, and for the preservation of the northern way of life. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It legalized treason in the minds of the participants. It allowed loyal subjects to take up arms against the government while still claiming to love the king. He gave them a symbol that was profoundly emotional and visually terrifying to their enemies, the 5 wounds of Christ. Their banners did not bear the crests of warlords. They bore the bleeding hands, feet, and side of Jesus. It was a crusader symbol. It told every man marching, from the plowman to the knight, that they were soldiers of Christ. They were fighting not just for their farms, but for the very soul of England. By mid-October 1536, the impossible happened. The one-eyed lawyer transformed a chaotic rabble into a disciplined military machine. He organized the men by their parishes. He appointed captains. He established a chain of command. He strictly forbade looting. He issued orders that any man caught stealing even a loaf of bread would be hanged. This was unheard of in medieval warfare, where armies were expected to live off the land. Robert Aske marched on the city of York with an army estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 strong. This was not a horde of barbarians. This was a spiritual army. When they reached the gates of York, the city did not resist. They threw open the doors. Aske rode into the city, not as a conqueror, but as a savior. He went straight to the Minster, the great cathedral at the heart of the North. There, he issued a simple, powerful decree. The expelled monks and nuns were to return to their houses. He began to undo the king's work. The momentum was unstoppable. The great nobles of the North, who should have stopped Aske, found themselves swept up in the tide. Lord Darcy, the commander of Pontefract Castle, the Gibraltar of the North, the key military fortress of the region, was an old soldier who hated Cromwell. When Aske's army surrounded Pontefract, Darcy surrendered. But he didn't just surrender the castle. He surrendered his heart to the cause. He joined the pilgrimage, adding the legitimacy of the peerage to Aske's movement. Suddenly, Robert Aske, the barrister from Gray's Inn, held the keys to the North. He controlled the major cities. He controlled the major fortresses. And he stood at the head of an army that had swelled to nearly 40,000 men. These were well-armed men, many of them veterans of the border wars with Scotland. They were archers, billsmen, and knights, all united by a single holy purpose. Down in Windsor and London, the panic was absolute. King Henry VIII, who had always believed his will was absolute, found himself facing a nightmare. He scraped together a royal army under the command of the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk was the premier peer of the realm, a hardened soldier, and a ruthless politician. He marched north to crush the rebellion, but when Norfolk arrived at Doncaster and looked across the river, his blood ran cold. Norfolk had perhaps 8,000 men. They were cold, unpaid, and demoralized. Many of them secretly sympathized with the Pilgrims. Across the river, Aske had 40,000 men. They were well-fed, burning with religious zeal, and led by a man they worshipped. This was the pivot point of the century, the moment where history held its breath. Militarily, the war was over before it began. If Robert Aske gave the order to charge, the Duke of Norfolk's army would have been annihilated in an afternoon. The road to London would have been open. The king had no reserves. Aske could have marched to the capital, deposed Henry VIII, replaced him with his daughter Mary, and restored the Catholic Church. The Tudor dynasty might have ended right there in the mud of Doncaster in 1536. England would be a completely different country today. Aske had absolute military superiority. He had the power to change the world with a single word, but he didn't use it. Why? Because Robert Aske was not a revolutionary. He was a loyal subject. He looked across the river and saw the Duke of Norfolk, the representative of the king. To attack Norfolk was to attack the king, and Aske could not bring himself to do it. He believed with a heartbreaking purity that if he could just show the king the depth of the people's suffering, the king would listen. He didn't want to defeat the king. He wanted to negotiate with him. He wanted a parliament. He wanted the law to work. And that hesitation, that loyalty, that belief in the honor of the gentry was exactly what the king and the Duke of Norfolk were counting on. They knew they couldn't win a battle, so they decided to win a negotiation. The king sent secret instructions to the Duke of Norfolk. Do whatever it takes. Lie, promise, flatter. Agree to anything. Just get that army to disband. Get them to go home. Once they are scattered, we will destroy them one by one. The trap was set, and Robert Aske, standing tall under the banner of the 5 wounds, was about to walk right into it. The stage was now set for one of the most cynical deceptions in British history. On one bank of the river stood the raw power of the North, a force born of righteous anger and spiritual desperation. On the other stood the cold, calculating machinery of the Tudor state, armed not with swords, but with a weapon far more dangerous to a man like Robert Aske, a lie wrapped in the velvet of diplomacy. As the winter fog rolled in over the water, the military campaign was about to end, and the psychological warfare was about to begin. The air over the River Don on December 6th, 1536, was freezing. The water was dark, swollen with winter rain, separating 2 worlds. On one side stood the might of the North, pilgrims, monks, knights, and commoners, 40,000 strong, their breath steaming in the cold air, their banners of the 5 wounds stiff in the wind. On the other side stood the Duke of Norfolk, representing the crown, with a pitiful force that knew it was beaten. This was the moment Robert Aske had worked for. This was the victory. He rode out onto the bridge to meet the Duke. He carried with him the Pontefract Articles, a document that outlined the demands of the North. It was a manifesto for a return to the old ways, the restoration of the monasteries, the punishment of heretical bishops, the removal of Cromwell, and the legitimacy of the Lady Mary. Aske looked Norfolk in the eye. He spoke as an equal. He demanded a free parliament to be held in York to ratify these demands. He demanded a general pardon for every single man, woman, and child who had taken part in the pilgrimage, ensuring no one would face the hangman's noose for treason. And the Duke of Norfolk, he smiled. He nodded. He agreed to everything. "I pledge my honor," Norfolk said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "The king grants you a free pardon, A parliament will be held. The abbeys will stand. It was a lie so total, so absolute, that Aske couldn't see the edges of it. Norfolk had been instructed by Henry VIII to promise the moon if necessary. The king had no intention of keeping a treaty made with traitors. To Henry, a promise made to a rebel was not a promise. It was a tactic. But Aske, blinded by his own code of honor, believed that a peer of the realm could not perjure himself on such a sacred matter. Robert Aske rode back to his lines. He stood before the vast waiting host. Tears streamed down his face. He shouted to them that they had won. The king had listened. The king was their father after all. In a gesture that symbolized the suicide of the rebellion, Aske reached up and tore the badge of the 5 wounds from his tunic. He ordered his captains to do the same. "Go home," he told them. "Go back to your farms. We have saved the North." The captains were skeptical. The commons were reluctant. They muttered that they should finish the job. But Aske's charisma was absolute. He rode up and down the lines, persuading, cajoling, ordering. Slowly, tragically, the great army began to dissolve. The yeomen packed their tents, the knights sheathed their swords. The monks returned to their abbeys, believing they were safe. Within days, the most powerful military force in England had vanished like snow in the rain. Aske had disarmed the North with a single speech. Then the silence set in. For a few weeks it seemed as if the peace would hold. Then a messenger arrived at Aske's family home. It was a letter from the king himself. The language was intoxicating. Henry VIII wrote to Aske as a trusty and well-beloved subject. He expressed a great desire to speak with Aske personally, to hear from his own lips the grievances of the people, so that he might remedy them. He invited Aske to spend Christmas at the royal court in Greenwich. It was the ultimate validation. Aske believed he was going to London as a statesman, an ambassador for his people. He packed his best clothes. He said goodbye to his family. He rode south, not realizing he was riding into the lion's den. The Christmas of 1536 at Greenwich Palace was a masterpiece of royal theater. When Aske arrived, he was not thrown into a dungeon. He was ushered into the presence chamber. The king rose to greet him. Henry VIII, a man capable of terrifying violence, turned on the full wattage of his charm. He embraced Aske. He sat with him by the fire. He listened intently as Aske spoke of the poverty of the North, the fear of the commons, the hatred of Cromwell. Henry nodded sympathetically, playing the role of the benevolent father. "I had not known," the king lied. "You have done me a great service, Master Aske." Throughout the holiday season, Aske was feted. The king gave him a gift, a jacket of crimson satin. It was a princely garment. Aske wore it with pride, parading through the court. He did not realize the grim symbolism. In the eyes of the silent, watching courtiers and the lurking Thomas Cromwell, Aske was dressed in red because he was a marked man. He was a walking dead man. During these long fireside chats, Henry asked Aske to write a narrative of the rebellion. "Help me understand," the king said. "Write down who did what, so I can know who my true friends are." Aske, still believing he was a co-author of the piece, sat down and wrote a detailed account. He named names. He explained the organization. He laid out the network of the rebellion. He thought he was explaining the justice of the cause. In reality, he was providing the prosecution with a full confession and a detailed list of accomplices. In January 1537, Aske rode back north. He was high on success. He believed he had secured the future of his people. He wore his crimson jacket. He carried the king's promises in his pocket. But while Aske had been dining at Greenwich, the mood in the north had curdled. The people were not stupid. They saw that the king was strengthening his garrisons in Hull and Scarborough. They saw that the promised Parliament was not materializing. They saw that the Duke of Norfolk was marching north again, this time with a larger army, and he wasn't coming to talk. Enter Sir Francis Bigod. Bigod is the tragic counterpoint to Aske. He was a volatile, intellectual Protestant radical who had joined the pilgrimage for his own complex reasons. Unlike Aske, Bigod did not trust the king. He saw the Doncaster pardon for what it was, a stalling tactic. The king creates no parliament, Bigod shouted to the crowds in January 1537. The king intends to destroy us all. Bigod decided to act. He launched a new uprising. It was a desperate, disorganized affair. He tried to capture Hull and Scarborough, but he lacked Aske's leadership and the people's unity. When Robert Aske heard of Bigod's rising, he was horrified. He saw his fragile peace shattering. He knew that this was exactly the excuse Henry needed to break his word. In a desperate attempt to save the situation, Aske did something that sealed his fate. He wrote out and actively opposed Bigod. He made speeches telling people to go home. He worked with the royal officials to suppress the new rebellion. He tried to show the king, "Look, I am loyal. I am keeping the peace. This is not my doing." It was futile. News of Bigod's rising reached London. Henry VIII dropped the mask. The king declared that the North had broken the terms of the pardon. The treaty was void. The truce was over. "You shall cause such dreadful execution to be done upon a good number of the inhabitants of every town, village, and hamlet that have offended in this rebellion," Henry wrote to the Duke of Norfolk. "Hang them up in trees, quarter them, and set their heads and quarters in every town as a fearful warning." The Duke of Norfolk arrived in the north, and the bloodletting began. He declared martial law. The red-crimson jacket of Robert Aske could no longer protect him. In fact, it made him the primary target. Norfolk invited Aske to meet him, smiling his shark-like smile. "The king is displeased with this new trouble," Norfolk said, "but he knows you are innocent, Robert. He wants you to come to London again, just to clarify things." It was the same trap, but Aske, clinging to the wreckage of his worldview, clinging to the belief that the king was a man of honor, went. He must have known, deep down, that he was riding to his death, but he had no other card to play. He arrived in London in April. This time, there was no reception at Greenwich. There was no crimson satin. He was arrested immediately and thrown into the Tower of London. The shock must have been physical. One moment, a celebrated guest, the next, a prisoner in the dark, damp stone of the White Tower. But the worst was yet to come. He was taken to interrogation, and sitting across the table was not the king, but Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell, the man Aske had demanded be fired, now held Aske's life in his hands. We still have the records of the interrogation. It was ruthless. Cromwell fired 107 questions at Aske. He twisted Aske's words. He used the narrative Aske had written at Christmas against him. "You conspired to depose the king," Cromwell accused. "I conspired to save him," Aske pleaded. "You conspired with the imperial ambassador. I spoke only of the faith." It didn't matter. The verdict had been written before the trial began. On May 17, 1537, Robert Aske was brought to Westminster Hall. He was tried for high treason. The jury was packed. The judges were the king's men. Aske defended himself with the skill of a trained barrister. He argued that the general pardon, granted at Doncaster, covered all his actions during the pilgrimage. He argued that he had opposed Bigod's rebellion. Legally, he was innocent. But this was not a court of law. It was a court of vengeance. The judges ruled that his treason continued after the pardon because he had not turned in the rebels fast enough. He was found guilty. The sentence for high treason was the most barbaric punishment in English law: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, to be half strangled, castrated, disemboweled while alive, and then chopped into 4 pieces. Aske prepared himself for this end. He made his peace with God. But Henry VIII had one final twist of the knife. The king decided that a normal execution in London was too good for the King of the North. He wanted to make a statement that would scar the memory of Yorkshire forever. "It is our pleasure," the king wrote, "that Robert Aske shall be sent down to York, and there, in the city he presumed to rule, he shall be hanged in chains." Hanging in chains, gibbeting, was a fate worse than drawing and quartering. It denied the victim a Christian burial. It denied them a quick end. It was a spectacle of total domination. In late June, a cart rumbled out of the Tower of London. Robert Aske was in it, shackled, beginning the long, slow journey back to the north. Every mile he traveled was a mile he had once commanded. He passed through villages where men had once cheered him as a messiah. Now they peeked through shuttered windows, terrified to be seen looking at the condemned man. The countryside he passed through was a graveyard. The Duke of Norfolk's dreadful execution had done its work. In every village green, bodies swung from the trees. The abbots of the great monasteries, Jervaux, Fountains, Bridlington, had been hanged. The monks were gone. The lands were seized. The north had been broken. Robert Aske was returning home not as a savior, but as a ghost witnessing the destruction of his world. He arrived in York in early July. The city was under strict military occupation. The people were silent. On the morning of July the 12th, 1537, the sun rose over the city. The heat was already building. The soldiers came for him. They did not lead him to a block. They led him to the blacksmith. There on the ground lay the instrument of his passion, a cage of iron bands, shaped roughly like a human body. Aske was lifted up. The iron bands were clamped around his legs, his waist, his chest, his arms. They were hammered tight enough to hold him, tight enough to bruise, but not tight enough to kill him quickly. He was a man of the law, a man of words. But as the iron closed around him, words failed. He was now just meat for the king's crow. They dragged the cage to Clifford's Tower. The ascent was steep. The crowd was vast. He could see the minster in the distance, the church he had tried to protect. They hoisted him up. The chains creaked. The cage swung in the air, spinning slowly. He was suspended from the battlements, high above the city, between heaven and earth, belonging to neither. The soldiers secured the chains. The ladder was removed. Robert Aske was left alone with the sky. But death would not come quickly. With the trap sprung and the cage hoisted high, the grim reality of Henry's revenge began in earnest. Aske was suspended approximately 30 feet in the air. He was high enough to be out of reach of any compassionate hand that might try to pass him a cup of water, yet low enough that he could see the faces of the people passing below. He could see the familiar streets of York, the rooftops of the merchants' houses, and the distant shimmering flow of the River Ouse. The gibbet is a diabolical invention because it turns the human body against itself. Aske was not merely tied, he was encased. The iron bands, forged specifically for his measurements by a local blacksmith, formed a rigid lattice around him. There was a hoop around his ankles, one around his knees, one supporting his hips, another crushing his chest, and a final band around his neck to keep his head upright. These bands were tight. They had to be. If they were too loose, the prisoner might slip out and fall to a quick death. If they were too tight, they might cut off blood flow and kill him too fast. The art of gibbeting lay in the balance, keeping the victim alive for the maximum amount of time in the maximum amount of discomfort. As the first hour turned into the first afternoon, the sheer physical reality of his situation set in. It was July. The English summer of 1537 was recorded as being hot and dry. The sun beat down on the limestone walls of the tower, reflecting the heat back onto the hanging man. There was no shade. The first agony was the cramp. Imagine standing in one position, unable to shift your weight, unable to sit, unable to kneel. The muscles in Aske's legs would have begun to spasm uncontrollably within the first few hours. He would have tried to writhe, to stretch, but the iron bands held him fast. Every movement caused the metal to bite into his skin, bruising the flesh and chafing it raw. Then came the thirst. This is the true executioner in a gibbet. As the sun baked him, his body cried out for water. His tongue would have swollen in his mouth. His lips would have cracked. Below him, life in York went on. He could likely hear the sounds of the market, the church bells ringing the hours, the sound of water flowing in the river he could see but not touch. The psychological torture was designed to be as excruciating as the physical. Robert Aske was a man of immense dignity. He was a leader who had been treated with deference by earls and lords. Now, he was a public spectacle, stripped of all agency. He was forced to relieve himself where he hung, the filth running down his legs, adding shame to his suffering. The flies would have come next, buzzing around his face, landing on his open eyes. With his arms pinned to his sides by the iron, he could not even brush them away. Nightfall brought no relief. The temperature dropped, chilling his sweat-soaked clothes. The darkness brought isolation. Alone in the cage, swaying gently in the night breeze, Aske was left with his thoughts. He had time to replay every decision of the last 9 months. The decision to take the oath. The decision to stop the army at Doncaster. The decision to trust the Duke of Norfolk. The decision to accept the crimson coat from the king. Did he realize in those cold, lonely hours that his virtue had been his undoing? Did he understand that he was dying not because he was a traitor, but because he was a man of yesterday, trying to hold back the ruthless dawn of a new Machiavellian age? By the second day, the crowds had changed. At first, there had been shock. The people of York, who had cheered him months before, stared up in horror. But terror is a potent silencer. The presence of the king's soldiers at the base of the tower made it clear to show pity for Aske was to share his fate. Mothers hurried their children past the tower, averting their eyes. Men looked at the ground. Aske's voice, which had once commanded 40,000 men, was now reduced to a rasp. The records suggest he begged for water. He begged for death. But the orders from Henry VIII were strict. Let him hang. The king wanted the North to stare at this rotting piece of meat and see their own defeat. He wanted to break the spirit of the rebellion so thoroughly that it would never rise again. And he was using their beloved leader to do it. By the third or fourth day, accounts vary, and time becomes fluid in agony. Robert Aske would have begun to hallucinate. Dehydration causes the mind to fracture. Perhaps he saw the fires of the monasteries burning again. Perhaps he saw the face of Cromwell laughing. Or perhaps in his delirium he saw the 5 wounds of Christ, the symbol he had loved so much, merging with his own suffering. He was, in a very literal sense, a martyr. But he was not a martyr for the Protestant faith like those burned at Smithfield, nor was he a straightforward Catholic saint. He was a martyr for the Commonwealth, for the idea of a society where the rich protected the poor, where the king protected the church, and where a promise was a promise. He was dying for a version of England that Henry VIII was systematically murdering. Eventually the screaming stopped. The cage stopped shaking. The head slumped forward against the iron collar. It is said that as he died, he gazed out toward the horizon, toward the wolds and moors of Yorkshire that he had tried to defend. Robert Aske was dead, but the punishment was not over. Henry VIII had ordered that the body was not to be taken down. It was to be left to the elements. For weeks, then months, the cage remained on Clifford's tower. The birds of prey, the crows and kites that circle the towers of York, came to feast. The people of the city had to watch the slow decomposition of the man who had been their hope. It hung there through the autumn rains and the winter snows of 1537. It hung there until the flesh was gone and the bones began to bleach and disconnect. It hung there until it was no longer a man, but a wind chime of bones rattling against iron. It was a message written in bone. The Tudors are absolute. Resistance is death. With Aske's broken body serving as a silent sentinel over the city, the king's gaze turned to the others, the knights, the lords, and the women who had dared to dream of a different England. The cage at York was about to be joined by a chorus of suffering across the entire north. While Aske was suffering his slow agony in York, another tragedy was unfolding 30 miles away in the port city of Hull. The man at the center of this story was Sir Robert Constable. He was a war hero, a veteran of the glorious Battle of Flodden, where the English had crushed the Scots. He was nearly 70 years old, a grand old man of the north, ancient by Tudor standards. He was gruff, stubborn, and deeply respected. During the pilgrimage, he had held the city of Hull for the rebels. Like Aske, Constable had accepted the king's pardon. Like Aske, he had believed the promise of peace. And like Aske, he was dragged down to London, interrogated, and condemned. But Henry VIII had a specific cruelty in mind for Constable. He knew that Constable was the most respected military figure in the East Riding of Yorkshire. He wanted to humiliate him. On July 6, 1537, just days before Aske's execution, the old knight was taken to the Beverley Gate in Hull. This was the main entrance to the city he had once commanded. The king ordered that Constable too be hanged in chains. But there was a grotesque variation. Because Hull was a port city, the gibbet was placed in a location visible to all ships entering and leaving the harbor. Constable was hoisted up encased in iron to die of thirst and exposure. Imagine the scene. A 70-year-old war hero stripped of his dignity, left to scream his life away while foreign merchants and local fishermen sailed beneath him. The king was sending a message not just to England but to the world. Look at what I do to my heroes when they defy me. Constable's agony lasted for days. His body was left hanging until it fell apart, a rotting welcome sign to the city of Hull. But the vengeance was not limited to men. One of the most heart-wrenching and scandalous stories of the pilgrimage involves the only woman known to have been executed for her role in the uprising. Her name was Margaret Cheney, often referred to as Lady Bulmer. Margaret was a figure of scandal long before the rebellion. She was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, who had been executed by Henry VIII years earlier, which already marked her with bad blood in the king's eyes. She was the mistress of Sir John Bulmer, a powerful northern knight. They had lived together out of wedlock for years, a shocking breach of social norms, before finally marrying. When the pilgrimage began, Sir John and Margaret were enthusiastic supporters. Margaret, fierce and charismatic, reportedly urged her husband on. She was accused of inciting the Commons, of crying out that the king was a tyrant. When the rebellion failed, the government came for them. But while Sir John was beheaded, a quick, honorable death for a nobleman, Margaret was denied even that small mercy. Under Tudor law, a woman who rebelled against her sovereign was guilty of petty treason. It was viewed as a crime against the natural order, like a wife killing her husband. The punishment for a woman was not hanging nor drawing and quartering. It was fire. On May the 25th, 1537, Margaret Cheney was led out to Smithfield in London. She was not a witch, she was not a heretic, she was a political prisoner. Yet she was tied to a stake, wood was piled around her feet, and she was burned alive. The burning of Lady Bulmer shocked even the hardened London crowds. It was a rare and extreme act of cruelty to burn a noblewoman for political crimes. It showed that Henry's rage knew no gender. He was willing to incinerate a mother and wife just to prove that no one was safe. And then there was the tragedy of the Percys. If you know Northern history, you know the name Percy. The Earls of Northumberland were the uncrowned kings of the North. They were a dynasty older and, in their own lands, more loved than the Tudors. Henry VIII hated them. He was jealous of their power and suspicious of their loyalty. The head of the family at this time was Henry Percy, the 6th Earl of Northumberland. He is one of the most tragic figures in English history. As a young man, he had been deeply in love with Anne Boleyn before Henry VIII decided he wanted her. The king had forced Percy to break his engagement to Anne, breaking Percy's heart and spirit in the process. By 1537, Henry Percy was a broken man, sickly, depressed, and financially ruined. His younger brothers, Thomas and Ingelram Percy, had been active leaders in the Pilgrimage of Grace. They were dashing, popular, and everything the Earl was not. When the rebellion failed, the king arrested Thomas Percy. Then, Henry VIII performed a masterstroke of psychological torture. He appointed the sick, broken Earl of Northumberland to be one of the judges at the trial of his own brothers. Imagine the Earl's position. If he refused, he would be executed as a traitor, and his entire ancient house would be destroyed. If he agreed, he would have to sign the death warrant of his own flesh and blood. The Earl crumbled. He sat in judgment. He condemned his brother Thomas to a traitor's death. Thomas Percy was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn. The guilt destroyed the Earl. In a final act of total submission, or perhaps a final act of giving up on a world that had been nothing but cruel to him, Henry Percy, the 6th Earl, wrote to the king. He had no children. He declared that upon his death all the vast Percy lands, the castles of Alnwick, Warkworth, Cockermouth, the hundreds of thousands of acres, would be left not to his remaining family, but to King Henry VIII. He disinherited his own dynasty. He gave the king the one thing Henry had always wanted: total control of the North. A few weeks later, the 6th Earl died. They say he died of black jaundice, but those who knew him said he died of shame. The great house of Percy was extinguished, though it would miraculously rise again in later generations. The purge continued into the church. The king could not just kill the rebels. He had to kill the theology that supported them. He turned his eyes to the great abbots. The abbot of Jervaux, Adam Sedbar, had tried to stay out of the rebellion. When the rebels came to his abbey, he had actually fled to the moors to hide. The rebels dragged him back and forced him to join. It didn't matter. He was arrested. The abbot of Fountains, William Thirsk, was accused of theft and treason. These men were spiritual lords. In the past, their holy status would have protected them, but Henry stripped them of their robes. He tried them as common criminals. They were dragged to Tyburn in London. They were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their heads were boiled in cumin and tar to preserve them, then stuck on spikes on London Bridge. The message was clear: God will not protect you from Henry VIII. By the end of 1537, the North was quiet. It was the silence of a graveyard. The Council of the North was established in York. It was a bureaucratic machine designed to bypass the local gentry and govern directly from the crown. The distinct culture of the North, its feudal loyalty, its Catholic devotion, its sense of independence, was being strangled. The monasteries, now leaderless, fell like dominoes. The king's commissioners returned, this time with no resistance. They stripped the lead. They melted the bells. They smashed the stained glass. The great libraries of the North, containing books from the time of the Venerable Bede, were used to clean boots or sold to grocers to wrap fish. It was a cultural lobotomy. But amidst all this death and destruction, there is one final lingering question. What happened to the evil counselor, Thomas Cromwell? The man who had orchestrated all of this, the man who had tricked Aske, entrapped the Percys, and burned Lady Bulmer, was at the height of his power. He was made Earl of Essex. He was the wealthiest man in England. He seemed untouchable, but history has a way of rhyming. The mechanisms of terror that Cromwell built were perfect, too perfect. They required a master to run them, and they required a king who was satisfied. But Henry VIII was a black hole of need. He was never satisfied. Cromwell had destroyed the enemies of the king, but in doing so, he had made himself the only target left. He had promised Henry gold, and he had delivered it by melting down the church. He had promised Henry power, and he had delivered it by killing the nobility. But now, the gold was spent, and the power was absolute, and the king was bored and looking for a new wife. On the morning of July 28th, 1540, 3 years almost to the day after Robert Aske's body was hoisted onto Clifford's Tower, a different crowd gathered at Tower Hill in London. They were there to watch the execution of the Earl of Essex. But the man who mounted the scaffold was not a dashing knight or an ancient lord. It was the blacksmith's son, the king's fixer, the architect of the Reformation, Thomas Cromwell. History rarely offers such perfect geometric justice. Cromwell was the man who had drafted the laws that trapped the pilgrims. He was the man who had turned the king's heart to stone. He had amassed a fortune by looting the abbeys of the north, but the machine of terror he built had a flaw. It had no brakes. When Henry VIII turned against him, blaming Cromwell for the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell found himself caught in his own trap. He was condemned by a Bill of Attainder, a legislative device he had popularized to execute enemies without a trial. As he stood on the scaffold, the most feared man in England was trembling. He had begged the king for mercy in letters stained with tears, writing, "Most gracious prince, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." The king had read the letters, perhaps shed a tear, and then signed the death warrant anyway. The execution was a butchery. The executioner was inexperienced, or perhaps drunk, or perhaps paid to be cruel. It took 3 hacking blows to sever the neck of Thomas Cromwell, the brain that had dissolved the monasteries and outwitted Robert Aske, died in agony. But while the death of Cromwell might have felt like justice to the surviving families of the northern rebels, it did not undo the damage. The storm had passed, but the landscape of England was permanently altered. Imagine the heat of July 1537. Imagine the smell of the iron. Imagine the loneliness of the man who hung there. Robert Aske was the king that England never had. He was the leader who loved his people more than he loved power. In the end, Henry VIII had the crown, and Cromwell had the gold. But Robert Aske had the grace, and perhaps in the long silence of history, that is the only thing that matters. We must understand the sheer scale of the cultural devastation in the North. When Aske failed, the protective wall around Northern culture collapsed. Drive through Yorkshire today, and you will see the skeletons. Fountains, Abbey, Rievaulx, Jervaux, Bolton Priory, these are now romantic ruins, manicured by the National Trust, places where people go for Sunday walks. But try to see them through the eyes of a peasant in 1540. These were not ruins. They were bomb sites. When the lead was ripped from the roofs, the interiors were exposed to the relentless English rain. The intricate wooden carvings rotted. The libraries, housing the intellectual history of the North, were scattered. It is said that pages from ancient illuminated manuscripts were used by local grocers to wrap butter and fish, or by cleaners to polish boots. The music of the choirs, which had been sung continuously for centuries, was silenced. This was the stripping of the altars. It was the moment the north of England became the poor relation to the south, a dynamic that, some would argue, persists to this very day. The wealth of the north was siphoned off to London to build the palaces of the Tudors and the mansions of the new aristocracy who had bought the stolen church lands. A legend grew up in the years that followed, the curse of the monasteries. It was whispered that any family who bought the consecrated land of a dissolved abbey would suffer tragedy. Their heirs would die young. Their lines would fail. Their fortunes would vanish. And indeed, looking at the high mortality rate of the Tudor court, it was easy for the common people to believe that God was taking a slow revenge. But what of the spirit of the pilgrimage? Did it die with Robert Aske? Henry VIII thought so. He believed he had crushed the rebellion. He spent his final years as a bloated, paranoid tyrant, his leg ulcer stinking of rot, terrified of sickness and death. When he died in 1547, he left a child heir, Edward VI, and a country that was religiously schizophrenic and financially ruined. But you cannot kill an idea with an axe. The pilgrimage of grace went underground. The North remained stubbornly, defiantly Catholic for generations. They became recusants, people who refused to attend the new Protestant services. They paid fines. They hid priests in priest holes behind false walls in their manor houses. They sent their sons abroad to be educated. And here is the fascinating direct thread of history that links Robert Aske to one of the most famous events in the world. Go back to York, walk a few streets away from Clifford's Tower. There's a school called St. Peter's. In the late 1500s, decades after Aske's death, a young boy attended that school. He walked past the tower where the cage had hung. He heard the stories of the martyrdom. He lived in a city that still bore the scars of Henry's vengeance. That boy's name was Guy Fawkes. It is no coincidence that the gunpowder plot of 1605, the attempt to blow up the king and Parliament, was driven largely by men from the North and the Midlands. The rage that was ignited in 1536 did not burn out. It smoldered. Robert Aske tried to change the system by peaceful negotiation and was betrayed. 70 years later, Guy Fawkes and his conspirators looked at that betrayal and decided that negotiation was futile. They chose gunpowder instead. Robert Aske's failure paved the road for the radicalization of the English Catholics. The state's brutality taught the rebels that next time they should not stop at Doncaster Bridge. So, how do we judge Robert Aske today? In the grand narrative of English history, he is often a footnote. He is overshadowed by the wives of Henry VIII, by the glitz of Elizabeth I, by the drama of the Civil War. He didn't win. Winners write the history books, and the Tudors were the ultimate winners. But look closer. Robert Aske was a man out of time. He was a medieval man stepping into a modern world. He believed in a code of chivalry, that a king's word was his bond, that a handshake mattered, that justice existed. He was fighting against men like Cromwell and Henry, who represented the dawn of the modern political state, a state based on surveillance, propaganda, centralization, and the absolute power of the executive. Aske's tragedy was that he assumed his enemy had a soul. But there is a strange victory in his defeat. Robert Aske refused to unleash a civil war that would have killed thousands. He had the power to burn the country down, and he chose not to. He spared the mothers of the South the grief that the mothers of the North had to endure. He died a traitor's death, screaming in a cage, but he died with his integrity intact. Today, Clifford's Tower still watches over York. In the spring, daffodils bloom on the grassy mound where the crowds once stood to watch the execution. It is a peaceful spot, but if you climb those steps, pause for a moment at the top. Look out over the city.